You already know the silence. You've sat with it. You've watched the messages go unread, watched the warmth drain out of someone who used to reach for you without thinking. And in part 1, we talked about where that silence begins. The first layer, the surface reasons a man pulls away. But here's what we didn't get to: the deeper architecture. The part that most people never see, because it doesn't announce itself. It just settles in, quietly, like sediment at the bottom of still water. So if you've been wondering why understanding the first layer didn't make the silence hurt any less, this is why. Because there's more underneath. And that's exactly what we're going to sit with today. If you're someone who has loved a quiet man, or who is one, you already know that the silence isn't nothing. It's never nothing. It's the opposite of nothing. It's everything he doesn't know how to carry into language. And that distinction matters more than most people realise, because the moment you mistake his silence for indifference, you start responding to the wrong thing entirely. You start pushing against a wall that isn't actually a wall. It's a door, and it's locked from the inside, not to keep you out, but because he hasn't found the handle yet. Chapter 1. The shame that lives beneath the silence. Carl Jung once wrote that what we cannot face in ourselves, we project outward, or we bury it. And for a significant number of men, the silence isn't withdrawal from you, it's withdrawal from himself, from something inside him that he hasn't been given the language or the permission to examine. Shame is a particularly quiet emotion. Unlike anger, it doesn't announce itself. Unlike grief, it doesn't demand to be witnessed. Shame simply contracts. It makes a man smaller on the inside, while keeping the exterior completely intact. And from the outside, that contraction looks identical to coldness. Here's what shame actually does to communication. It doesn't just make it harder to speak, it makes speaking feel dangerous. Because when a man is carrying shame, every attempt to express vulnerability feels like an exposure of the very thing he's most afraid of being seen as. Insufficient. Not enough. So instead of risking that exposure, he goes quiet. He retreats into a version of himself that can't be judged because it can't be read. And the cruel irony is that the people closest to him, the ones he trusts most, are often the ones he goes most silent with, because they're the ones whose judgment will matter most. And this is the part that breaks people's hearts when they finally understand it. The silence isn't rejection, it's protection. He's protecting you from the weight of what he's carrying, and he's protecting himself from the terror of being truly seen and found lacking. It's a deeply lonely place to live, and the people on the outside of that silence, who feel the rejection of it, who feel the cold of it, they're also living in a deeply lonely place. Two people, both suffering, both protecting, both completely unable to reach across the distance. That's not indifference. That's one of the most painful configurations a relationship can take. Chapter 2. The emotional vocabulary problem. Now, this isn't an excuse, it's a map. And maps are only useful if you're honest about the terrain. The reality is that most men were raised in environments, whether family, culture, or peer group, where emotional literacy simply wasn't taught. Not because it was forbidden necessarily, but but because it was never modelled. Nobody sat across from them and said, "Here is what grief feels like in your chest. Here is how you name it. Here is what you do when it arrives." Instead, they learned that emotions were things you managed, quietly, alone. You didn't perform them, you didn't share them. You handled them, or you buried them and kept moving. And so, by the time that boy becomes a man, and someone he loves asks him, genuinely, gently, "What are you feeling right now?" the honest answer isn't, "I don't want to tell you." The honest answer is, "I don't actually know." He can feel the weight of something, he can feel the pressure of it, but he doesn't have the words for it because he was never given the words. He was given silence as a coping mechanism so early that it became invisible to him. It's not a choice he's making in the moment, it's the only tool he was handed, and he's been using it for so long that he's forgotten it's even a tool. Nietzsche wrote that the most personal is the most universal, and here's where that lands. This emotional vocabulary problem isn't unique to any one man. It's generational, it's cultural, it's been passed down like a family heirloom nobody asked for. And recognizing that doesn't mean accepting it as permanent. It means understanding that when he goes silent, he may genuinely be standing in front of an internal landscape he has no language for, and the silence is him trying to navigate it alone, the only way he knows how. That's worth sitting with, not because it makes the silence easier to bear, but because it changes what the silence actually means.
Chapter 3. The Fear of Becoming a Burden. There's a particular kind of man, and if you know him, you recognize him immediately, who would rather dissolve quietly than ask for help, who would rather carry something until it breaks him than risk the possibility of being too much for someone he loves. And this fear, the fear of being a burden, is one of the most under-examined reasons a man goes silent. Because it doesn't look like fear from the outside. It looks like self-sufficiency. It looks like strength. It looks like he's fine, he's handling it. But underneath that composure is a man who has decided, often unconsciously, that his pain is not worth your time. And where does that decision come from? It comes from the same place the emotional vocabulary problem comes from. It comes from early experiences where his needs were either dismissed or where he watched someone he loved become overwhelmed by their own pain. And he quietly decided that he would never add to that weight. He would be the one who was fine. He would be the one who didn't need anything. And over time, that decision calcified into identity. He doesn't just choose not to burden you. He genuinely believes that his inner life is not something you should have to deal with. And so he carries it alone. And the silence is the sound of that carrying. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." But there's a shadow side to that stoic wisdom, and it's this. When a man internalizes that philosophy without balance, he starts to believe that needing anything from another person is a failure of that internal power. That asking for support is a crack in the armor. And so he maintains the armor. He maintains the silence. He keeps the inner world sealed
Not because he doesn't trust you, but because he doesn't trust himself to be vulnerable without losing the only version of himself he knows how to be. Chapter 4. When the silence is a test he doesn't know he's running. This one is harder to say because it requires a level of honesty that most people aren't comfortable with. But some silences, not all, but some, are unconscious tests. He pulls back, he goes quiet, and somewhere beneath the surface, a part of him is watching. Will you stay? Will you chase? Will you prove that the connection is real? Or will you confirm his deepest fear, that he's ultimately alone, even when he's loved? This isn't manipulation in the deliberate sense. It's more like an old wound running an old program, a pattern established long before you arrived.
Jung called this the shadow, the unconscious part of the self that operates beneath our awareness, driving behavior we'd never consciously choose. And the shadow doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, "I'm going to withdraw now to see if you follow." It just withdraws. And then it watches. And depending on what happens next, whether you pursue, whether you give space, whether you react with anger or with patience, it files that information away. It updates the internal model. It either confirms the wound or begins very slowly to heal it. The tragedy is that neither of you may know this test is happening, and that's precisely why it's so hard to pass. So what do you do with that? Honestly, and I want to be careful here, because this isn't advice in the prescriptive sense, but the most grounded response to a silence that might be an unconscious test is not to perform for it, not to chase in a way that confirms the pattern, and not to punish the silence in a way that confirms the fear. The most grounded response is to simply remain, to be present without being desperate, to communicate clearly, once, calmly, that you're here, that you're not going anywhere, and that whenever he's ready, the door is open. And then to actually mean it. That kind of steadiness is rare, and it's the only thing that has a chance of reaching past the test to the person underneath it. Chapter 5. The silence after conflict. There's a specific kind of silence that arrives after something breaks, after a fight, after a hard conversation, after a moment where something true was said and neither of you knew what to do with it. And this silence is different from the others. It's not shame, exactly. It's not the burden fear. It's something more like overwhelm. The nervous system of someone who processes emotions slowly, and many men do, needs time after emotional intensity, not because they're shutting you out, but because they've hit a threshold, and the only way through is to go inward and wait for the system to settle. John Gottman's research, and this is one of the most important pieces of data in relationship psychology, found that during conflict, men's cardiovascular systems become flooded significantly faster than women's and take significantly longer to return to baseline. What that means in plain language is this: when a fight gets intense, he may genuinely need to step away, not to win, not to punish, not to abandon, but because his body is in a state where productive communication is physiologically impossible. He's not choosing the silence over you. His nervous system is choosing survival over further escalation, and the silence is the only tool he has to create the space his body needs to come back. Now, and this is important, understanding that doesn't mean the silence is always handled well. It doesn't mean that disappearing for 3 days without a word is acceptable. It doesn't mean that the person on the other side of that silence doesn't deserve acknowledgement. It means that there's a difference between a man who goes quiet because he's processing and a man who goes quiet because he's punishing. And learning to tell the difference for both of you is one of the most valuable things you can do. Because one of those silences asks for patience, and the other asks for a very different kind of conversation entirely. And here's the thread I want to leave you with before part 3, because there's one more layer we haven't touched yet, and it's the deepest one. It's the layer that determines whether any of this ever changes, whether the silence becomes language, whether the distance becomes closeness, whether the man who has been quiet for years or decades ever finds his way back to himself and to the people who've been waiting. That layer is identity, who he believes he is, and whether he believes that a quieter, more open version of himself is still him. That's where we go next, and it's worth the wait. For now, if you're the one living inside this silence, or the one living beside it, I want you to hold one thing. The silence is not the truth of who he is. It's the shape of what he hasn't yet been able to say. And that distinction, small as it sounds, changes everything about how you stand in relation to it. You don't have to fix it today. You don't have to understand all of it tonight. You just have to stay honest about what you're experiencing, and patient enough to let the deeper work unfold at the pace it actually moves at, which is slow and quiet, and sometimes almost invisible, until it isn't.